In first Pepsis, you eat something. It goes to the stomach where it starts to be broken down. And this is by the help of a little bit of black bile. And the black bile provides a little bit of the acid flavor to stoke the digestive fire. And black bile also has a constricting energetic direction. So black bile is seen as the force that constricts the esophageal sphincter, which prevents food from coming back up. From the stomach, the digested mass travels to the intestines, where the usable is separated from the unusable. The usable is absorbed and the unusable is excreted. First Pepsis is purely catabolic, breaking things down. And this is fairly close to modern digestion, at least conceptually, but with some key differences that we'll get into. Now, we made a point in the previous video on teleology of explaining the instrumental faculties and explaining they operate through the humors and the organs. This is important because ancient humoral medicine didn't know anything about stomach acid and enzymes. They didn't have that mechanistic understanding. It wasn't observable. You wouldn't see stomach acid on dissection. You would only see it when someone vomits or feel it with heartburn. In either case, it would be considered a pathology. You also, of course, wouldn't see enzymes working either. And because you don't have that, you can't observe that, you need a different way to explain what's happening on a microstructure, cellular, and molecular level, even if you have no idea what cells and molecules are. The instrumental faculties, when acting in the stomach and intestines in first Pepsis, are how this is explained. But remember, we have two kinds of faculties, governing and instrumental faculties. The governing faculties are the animal in the brain, the vital in the heart, and the natural in the liver. And they work with the animal, vital, and natural spiritus, or pneumata. The instrumental faculties in the organs and tissues are attraction, retention, alteration, and expulsion. Now, how do these faculties work together? The instrumental faculties are how an organ does its job. Attraction is the power to take something in. Retention is the power to hold on to it so it can be acted upon. Alteration is the actual act of acting upon something and transforming it. And excretion is the power to get rid of it or send it somewhere else. And these four instrumental faculties explain how food is broken down in the GI. But these faculties need to be coordinated, both in their own organs and across organs. Organs don't act on their own in isolation. They act under the direction of something. This coordination occurs by way of the governing faculties. And in regard to Pepsis, this happens by way of the natural faculty of the liver. The natural faculty organizes and coordinates the digestive process itself. It is a kind of organizing and driving force. It's similar to modern medicine. The stomach and intestines don't act on their own. They act through the direction of the enteric nervous system. So I think you could make the argument that the humoral kind of sort of equivalent to the enteric nervous system is the natural faculty located in the liver. And just like the enteric nervous system in modern medicine is vegetative, the natural faculty in humoral medicine is as well. It is the bare, essential, most primitive functioning faculty that requires no higher order or cognitive function at all. And it's interesting to note that many medical systems give the liver an influential role in digestion. In addition to humoralism, Chinese medicine and Ayurveda does as well. And of course, also modern medicine describes the functions of the liver as a digestive and metabolic integrator producing bile acids, regulating carbohydrate and lipid metabolism, detoxifying absorbed compounds, and communicating with the gut by way of the enterohepatic circulation and the gut-liver axis. So a lot of different seemingly unrelated medical systems saying the same thing. Now, let's talk about the specifics of what actually happens. First, you eat something. Then the faculty of retention holds the ingested food in the stomach. Food in the stomach is acted upon by the faculty of alteration, and by means of heat, it is broken down. The humors are not involved in first Pepsis in the stomach, except, of course, as mentioned, for a little bit of black bile, which is there again to stimulate the digestive fire due to its acidity and to close the esophageal sphincter. In the stomach, Pepsis happens entirely by the heat of the calor innatus and the calor instrumentalis, which are the same thing, just specifically in the stomach. So calor innatus means innate heat, the heat of the body, which is life itself, and calor instrumentalis means instrumental heat, and that is the heat every organ has as its own instrumental heat. So in this specific case, calor innatus is converted by the stomach to the calor instrumentalis specific to the stomach itself. And in doing so, this heat is essentially intensified to make it a kind of cooking heat. And through this heat, the faculty of alteration breaks the food apart by way of the cooking process. Remember, there's no idea of enzymatic activity, into a homogeneous, crude, nutritive fluid called chyle. Chyle is the in-between stage between food, which is external to the body, and the humors, which are internal to or part of the body. Yellow bile, black bile for the most part, and phlegm should not be present in the stomach itself. Blood should not be present in the cavity of the stomach either. And if they are, this is a pathology. So the humors do not have a direct role in first Pepsis. They do, however, have an indirect role. And this is by way of, for example, the blood, which carries the calor innatus required by the stomach. Blood also supplies nutrition to the stomach and to the intestines to keep those organs vital and moist. And blood also carries with it the other humors. Remember that while what should be primarily flowing in the arteries and veins is blood, there is a small amount of yellow bile, a small amount of black bile, and a slightly larger amount of phlegm that also flows with the blood. And they don't flow in solution. They're not dissolved into the blood. Rather, they flow as an admixture. A healthy state is when blood is the most abundant, and the other humors are lesser and in balanced amounts. If there is that healthy balance, then there is good temperature, there is good moisture, and there is good tone of the organ and the tissue. And this good tone allows the organ and the tissue to do its job. In the case of the stomach, that job is to amplify the calor innatus to the calor instrumentalis for the sake of digestion. However, if the other humors become disproportionate, then the environment of the organs themselves changes, either by becoming too hot, or too cold, or too moist, or too dry. That means they can't do their job well. So if there is too much yellow bile carried with the blood, you can get a stomach that is hot and dry. If there is too much phlegm, you can get a stomach that is cold and wet. So the imbalance of heat and moisture will have an effect upon organ, muscle, and tissue tone. For example, yellow bile is like a flame on a stove under your cooking pot. And just like a flame under a pot, it has to be balanced. If the flame is too hot, meaning the stomach tissue itself has become too hot and dry because of a bilious constitution, then the food burns and bitter char is created. And I'm sure everyone has burned sauce on the bottom of a pan or overcooked something on the grill, and we know what that flavor and quality is like. This is chyle that is hot and burnt. Being hot and burned, it becomes too acrid and irritating. And this leads to downstream problems of irritability, heartburn, digestive upset, etc., as that acrid quality doesn't just stay in the stomach, it starts to spread to other organs. And this can look like, in modern terms, inflammation or infection of the stomach or intestines. It can also look like a kind of nervous system overexcitation where there's too much sympathetic tone due to irritation of the nerves. This nervous tension then prevents proper peristaltic movement, mostly by speeding things up, or if it's too intense, by causing spasm. On the other hand, if the flame is too cold, then it doesn't cook and thicken, and the chyle is too thin and lacks nutrition. And this looks like fatigue, gas, bloating, low stomach acid, and lack of GI tone. And when we get into the spiritus or numata, this can look like brain fog and mental fatigue. Looking at phlegm, if there's too much phlegm, then the stomach becomes cold and moist. Or we could say it's kind of filled with a lot of cold, moist fluid. And this weakens its coctive or alterative faculty. So food doesn't get broken down. And this is like putting a heat diffuser over a burner to make sure that the flame is not too intense. And in this sense, the diffuser works too well. It diffuses the heat too much. There's not enough heat to actually cook anything. But in this case, the stomach itself, or the calor innatus, or the calor instrumentalis, isn't too weak. It's being blocked, and it's being blocked by the phlegm. Too much black bile, lastly, would create a tissue state that is too dry and rigid with no elasticity or suppleness, so can't absorb moisture, spastic, things like that. Importantly, these humoral states happen to the tissues themselves. So these are tissue states, as tissue states are created by the blood substrate that feed it and by the admixture that the blood carries. This is not yet looking at the accumulation of the humors in the hollow organ of the stomach. Now, why will an imbalance of humoral admixture in the blood affect one organ differently than another? This is because each organ draws to it different humoral qualities of the blood based upon what the organ, needs. And this is because each organ has a different base temperature and moisture, and so it has different strengths and weaknesses. And some organs are inherently stronger and some inherently more delicate than others. And also because each organ changes the blood as it passes it on to the next. Now, getting back to first Pepsis itself, the bulk of digestion happens in the stomach by way of heat alone, as we said, not dependent upon the humors. This, we need to understand, is a cooking process. And this is a good point to stop for an aside and consider how central the idea of heat was to life in pre-modern culture. Certainly, a common experience in ancient peoples was to sit around a fire and watch this mysterious flame move and twist and turn as if it were alive, and to listen to the crackle, pop, and hiss of the fire almost as if it's speaking. And in the darkness, with nothing but that rhythmic and hypnotic flicker, that flame is elemental, something on the border of life and death, the dead wood it consumes and the living people watching it, and also, primordially, beyond any of it. This ultimate transformation and consumption process then as now, is a deeply spiritual metaphor. And in the dead and cold of night, with nothing but the warmth of the fire or the feeling of a warm body beside you if you were lucky, you could not help but appreciate that what separated life from death was heat. To an ancient person, really what separated a living being from a beautiful corpse was warmth, the fire of life within. And so when people became agrarian and began to cook with pots, it's only natural that the idea of internal fire was extended to specific processes of the body, in particular digestion. And living in ancient times, seeing food cook and break down in a pot would have been an everyday experience. And the heat process of stew cooking on a stove or fire reducing wood to ash would have explained the transformation of the food you take in and the waste you excrete. Another daily occurrence would have been seeing vegetables fermenting in a pot, or turning over a pile of compost and manure in the winter and seeing big billows of hot steam rising from it. People would have appreciated that that steam smells like a fart. And of course, they would have thought there has to be the same transformative heat process happening inside of them. And so they would have looked at the stomach as a big pot inside of the body for cooking or fermenting ingested food. And lastly, spicy foods, which speed digestive transit and thin cold mucus, register in the body subjectively as thermally hot. So another heat is digestive process correlation. So it's no coincidence that all three major classical medical systems of the ancient world, Greek Humoral, classical Chinese, and Ayurvedic, described digestion as a cooking process involving heat. I think most, if not all, pre-modern cultures described the digestive process in that way. If you know of any that didn't, let us know in the comments. I'd be really curious to know. In humoral medicine, there was the calor innatus and the calor instrumentalis. In classical Chinese, there was the spleen yang related to the kidney yang. And Ayurvedic medicine had the most clear and obvious references to fire of them all. Jataragni, the fire of the stomach, starts the process of digestion. The 5 Bhutagni, the elemental fires of earth, water, fire, air, and space, then take over. The 7 Dhatu Agni, the tissue-specific fires of the plasma, blood, muscle, fat, bone, marrow, and reproductive fluids, then continue the cooking process. And Agni, of course, is cognate to Latin igni. Sanskrit and Latin are very closely related, and both Agni and igni derive from the Proto-Indo-European word for fire, inguinus. And of course I'm mispronouncing that, but nobody knows how to pronounce it. So this pure fire is the digestive process of the stomach, and the majority of first pepsis happens in the stomach. And the result of digestion in the stomach is the homogeneous nutritive fluid called chyle. So, summing up where we are so far. This pure fire is the digestive process of the stomach. And the majority of first pepsis happens in the stomach. And the result of digestion in the stomach is the homogeneous nutritive fluid called chyle. But first pepsis isn't finished yet. This chyle that's produced is still too thin to be useful. So, as it moves from the stomach to the intestines, where it will be absorbed, it goes through a final thickening and refining process. When it passes from the stomach into the duodenum, the gallbladder sends yellow bile. This yellow bile in the duodenum cooks and thickens the chyle further. The presence of yellow bile, with its refining and purifying nature, also prevents the chyle from rotting. As it passes into the intestines continue the cooking process, but this time with a milder heat than the stomach for the final ripening of the food. And while the heat of the intestines is milder, the attractive faculty of the intestines is stronger. So the small intestine is the organ where the nutritive substance of the chyle is extracted, or attracted away from, the unusable waste. And when the chyle is the appropriate thickness, this same faculty of attraction brings it to the mesenteric veins, and from there it travels to the portal vein and goes to the liver. The waste is then passed to the large intestine, and the large intestine attracts the waste to itself, away from the body, so that it can be excreted. So, what this all means is that the site of digestion is the stomach and intestines. But the ability of digestion to occur by action of these organs depends upon the blood and its humoral admixture that built the stomach and intestines and continually nourishes them. We can think about it this way. An organ is a tissue with a particular form and a particular qualitative constitution. That form and constitution carry the potential to do something. That is its natural faculty. This is expressed through the instrumental faculties. Every faculty depends upon the condition of the tissue, and the condition of the tissue depends upon the humors. Therefore, all weakness of the faculties ultimately stems from humoral imbalance, whether that imbalance is internally or externally caused. Thus, if the end result of first Pepsis is chyle, and we do not obtain good chyle, and we assume the patient's diet and regimen are in proper order, then the root of the failure must lie in the humors. The same applies when the blood is corrupted, or the pneuma or spirits are disturbed. These are simply expressions of an underlying humoral disorder. In humoral medicine, every intervention, dietary, pharmaceutical, behavioral, or environmental, is ultimately aimed at correcting the mixture of the humors, and through them, the constitution of the organs. That is why it is called humoral medicine. So that is first Pepsis, and the end result of first Pepsis is chyle. Now, a quick aside. Chyle was inferred by Galen. It was not observed. Later anatomists did observe that there was, in fact, a lipid-rich milky substance of fats absorbed from the small intestine into the mesenteric lymphatic vessels. And they did end up calling this chyle. But this is because the word was already there. They were not labeling the same concept. So the chyle used in modern anatomy is not the chyle as used by Galen in humoral medicine. Okay, so that's a lot of theory to digest, no pun intended. Now let's talk about where modern medicine and humoral medicine differ in important ways. Remember, this model was from 2,000 years ago, and anatomical dissection was nowhere near as refined, obviously. And also, what was being dissected was primarily animals, and those observations were extrapolated onto people. So, there are going to be things that are not anatomically or physiologically accurate. Let's ignore the humors and the faculties, because that's more of an issue of theory and philosophy. And instead, let's look only at some of the anatomy and physiology. First, humoral medicine's cooking that occurs in the stomach and intestines is conceptualized as cooking by way of temperature, as we said. And we now know this cooking happens by way of acids and enzymes. So we now know that this cooking is not a thermal cooking, but a chemical cooking. Next, the nutrient-rich fluid chyle was considered a single homogeneous fluid absorbed from the stomach through the portal vein to the liver. And we now know that what is broken down is not a single homogeneous fluid, but all kinds of sugars, amino acids, lipids, etc. Chyle was also considered to be the direct precursor to blood, and blood formation happened in the liver. We now know that the direct byproducts of metabolism are not immediate precursors to blood. We also know that blood production happens mainly in the bone marrow, starting with hematopoietic stem cells that divide into myeloid cells and lymphoid cells. Now let's consider blood specifically, because the extreme difference in description in something seemingly so easy to define as blood brings up an important consideration. It's easy to dismantle humoral theory by pointing out they didn't even understand what something as basic as blood really was. But we also have to really consider that the blood that humoralists were talking about, the thing they could literally point to and bleed out of the body, was not really the same thing that modern medicine calls blood. And this doesn't mean they were wrong. It means they were describing a different thing. After all, blood in humoralism has an assigned temperature, moisture, and element. It has a correlated psychological disposition. Its formation and movement are different. Its functions are different. Its basic makeup is different. None of this is present in the modern conceptualization of blood. So, one could argue that the blood of humoral medicine is not at all the blood of modern medicine. They were simply not describing the same phenomena. Said a different way, modern blood is a part of biology, obviously. Humoral blood is part of cosmology and correlation. Therefore, the comparison is really disingenuous. And this brings up interesting questions about how you define and label something. What are the underlying biases? Are we really looking at something on its own terms? And I remember getting into a disagreement with a translator about the Chinese medical name for the organ called the spleen. He said the Western and Chinese spleens were the same. I said they were different. They happen to have the same label, but they represent entirely different things, intersecting only in the agreement of the physical organ being talked about, but not their actual functions at all. So, as a translator, what do you have fidelity to? Technical jargon or semantic field? The problem I was trying to point out was prioritizing lexical equivalence over conceptual equivalence. And I think the same thing is happening with the humoral concept of blood. And of course, whether you agree or disagree is entirely up to you. Now, let's look at the other humors through the same lens. Obviously, from a modern point of view, humors aren't real. And that's fair. But real depends upon what your view of the humors is. Are they literal, tangible things? Or are they organizing principles in a grander theory? Or are they both? In a system like this, whether something is real or not depends as much on what you can do with it as whether you can see it. In other words, does a theory that rests upon humors get results? Does it effectively treat the patient? In this sense, you don't really prove anything with physiology. You only know if your theory works by looking at it and treating pathology. After all, pathology is physiology gone awry. So, if you can fix pathology, your theories of physiology must be at least kind of right. And I don't mean in the dismissive, a broken clock is right twice a day way. We can illustrate this with an example. Suppose you have excess yellow bile in the stomach. The symptoms are acid reflux, bitter taste, flushed face, irritability, a little feeling of heat or flushing, smelly loose bowels multiple times per day, and cramping and spasming of the stomach and abdomen. A Western diagnosis might be a kind of generic GERD or reflux. In any event, there is a loss of tone of the lower esophageal sphincter and elevated stomach acid. If there is an ulcer, then there's also erosion of the stomach lining. There will also likely be local inflammation and possibly also downstream problems such as dysbiosis, especially if there has been a lot of antacid or H2 blocker use. Constant pain from GERD will aggravate the vagus nerve and upregulate the sympathetic nervous system, making one irritable and edgy and causing facial flushing. As said, the standard modern treatment is antacids, H2 blockers, and proton pump inhibitors. Now, a humoral treatment can be found in a formula from the Ontodotarium Nicolai called oxazocare. It reads as follows. Oxazocare is so called from oxy, which means vinegar, and zucchero, which means sugar. It is useful in acute tertian fevers and not truly in quartans. It purges yellow bile present in the stomach. Take 1 pound of sugar, 8 ounces of the juice of pomegranates, and 4 ounces of vinegar. Place them over the fire in a lined vessel and let it boil, constantly stirring with a spatula until it reaches the thickness of sugar, so that it can be carried in a small box. It is given in the morning with warm water in a dose of 1.5 ounces. So what is this formula doing? We know from the description that it's getting rid of yellow bile. It has pomegranate juice, vinegar, and sugar, a lot of sugar. And when we look at the structure of the formula, pomegranate is listed in Ibn Sina's Natural Pharmaceuticals as cold and moist. Energetically, cold and moist therapeutics are the antidote to hot and dry yellow bile. So, it purges the heat and dryness of the yellow bile. It's also described as sour. And in classical humoral medicine, herbs are not generally described by taste the same way that they are in modern Western herbal medicine or Chinese herbal medicine. So it's important that it's mentioned here, and we'll get to that in a sec. Not only is pomegranate cold and moist, it's specifically listed as relieving muscle spasms in the digestive system and having somewhat of a laxative effect. So it relaxes, cools, and moistens to flush out yellow bile. It's aided in this by vinegar. Vinegar is also cold and moist and has a drying function. This seems a little contradictory. What this means is that vinegar is moist because it's a liquid, but it's also astringent. So it has a drying effect upon the body, particularly membranes, and upon fluid substances. So it is seen as breaking the yellow bile apart to be flushed out. And this corresponds in modern terms to vinegar dissolving bile salts and promoting gastric emptying. Of course, bile salts are not yellow bile. Sugar can go a lot of different ways because there are a lot of different kinds of sugar. And by that I mean in unrefined sugars, we're not just talking about sucrose, fructose, or glucose combinations. We're also talking about plant byproducts. So the kind of sugar in different recipes makes a difference. But here, mostly what the sugar is for is to protect the mucosal membranes from too much dryness that is being caused by the heat of the yellow bile, and also to protect the mucosal membranes against the vinegar. So we have 2 cold ingredients, pomegranate and vinegar. And in energetic terms, we know cold means going from a state of more energy to less energy. So cold moves the tissue or the organ away from hyperfunction, excitability, inflammation, into a state of reduced function, calm, relaxation, reduction of inflammation. In terms of modern physiology, the humoral concept of cold would look like something that slows down the nervous system, is anti-inflammatory, antipyretic, and maybe also antibiotic if that infection comes with local heat and swelling, and not all infections do. Viewed through a Western lens, excess bile acids in the stomach irritate the nerves. They act on TRPV1 receptors, ASIC, the acid-sensing ion channels, and vagal nociceptive fibers, and cause sympathetic nervous system overactivation. They're really irritating. That's going to look like, in addition to pain, nausea, jitteriness, flushing, and agitation. So if pomegranate is described as cold and having an affinity for the stomach and intestines, and addressing yellow bile, which is a state of heat and excess, it's going to have to put the brakes on those things by downregulating, relaxing, and subjectively cooling things off. And it plausibly does this through several mechanisms. Punicalagins in pomegranate decrease vagal nociceptive firing. They reduce TRPV1 activation. They stabilize enteric sensory neurons, and they decrease nausea signaling. So in short, they work to reduce nerve irritation. The punicalagins and ellagic acid are also GABAergic, meaning they increase, mimic, or enhance GABA. GABA is, of course, the main inhibitory neurotransmitter. They also reduce neuroinflammation. They also lower gastric inflammatory cytokines, thus treating inflammation and also reducing sympathetic activation. So this means downshifting a nervous system that has been revving up due to bile acid irritation. And all of these mechanisms are what is captured by the description of cold. Of course, ancient humoral physicians obviously didn't know how exactly pomegranate worked in modern terms, but they could chart with fine detail that it did and the way in which it did. Now, back to the description of sour. Pomegranate is specifically described as sour in the Canon of Medicine, Volume 2, Natural Pharmaceuticals. Now, flavors were not descriptors or ways of explaining herbal energetics in humoralism. So we know that this is an important distinction for this herb and must be special in how it exerts its effect. And this makes sense. Sour flavors act on TRPV1 and TRPA1 receptors, and also modulate ASIC channels. The effect of this is muscle relaxation. Sour flavors relieve muscle cramping, and this muscle cramping is present in humoral terms in yellow bile in the stomach, manifesting as abdominal guarding and spasming. TRP receptor activation directly relieves this. Incidentally, this is also why grandma or grandpa or somebody might have kept pickle juice in the fridge or mustard by the bed to relieve muscle cramps at night. A lot of the time we default think that muscle aches are due to electrolyte imbalance. Often it's due to nerve imbalance, too much sympathetic tone. And this shows up at night because you stop moving, and in stillness, held muscle tension becomes very obvious and uncomfortable. Pickle juice, or mustard, because of the vinegar, activates the TRP receptors and causes relaxation. Now, would this formula work? I have no idea. I've never tried it. It looks interesting. How much pomegranate would you actually need for these pharmacological effects? I have no idea on that either. I haven't dug that far into it. Maybe it's totally possible with this formula. Maybe it takes gallons. Maybe that's why it's cooked down so much. But it's still interesting because it would seem the classic formula is capturing something. And honestly, it seems a lot more compelling than Rolaids and acid blockers. But the point is yellow bile a real thing? Are any of the humors real things? Maybe, maybe not. It depends upon what you define as real. Does real mean physical form you can point to? Or can something be real as function or theory? And if that theory enables you to come up with a novel and effective solution, well, that seems pretty useful and maybe also real.